Hi Internet, my name is Zeospantera and I run Z Reviews, and I'm hoping to make this video the most comprehensive video explaining how to add a subwoofer to any particular type of speaker system. Now it's going to probably be a real long video, so please feel free to use the time skips to get to the type of system that you have or are planning to know all the tips and tricks. I've spent hours gathering the items. I've got a selection of 5 subwoofers there. I've figured out that there are not 3, not 4, but 5 different types of speakers. And let's just quickly go over those. Because it's sort of like an education thing. Like, did you know that there was 5? I obviously didn't. But I've worked it out that there are passive speakers. Depending on what you've got now, I will tell you how to add from the different types of subs. Because if you can plan from the start what kind of system you want, it'll be a lot easier before we start getting into coaxial fiber optic splitters and MiniDSPs and the different types of sources. So again, thank you for following. Patreon, subscribe, start to support this channel and my mad ravings. Let's move on. So the 5 types of speakers that I could think of, I have gathered here. The first is passive speakers. These just have speaker terminals. They're not self-amplified. You have to provide an amplifier to move the speaker. So that's number 1 is passive. I'm doing the thing that what's his name from Mythbusters? Adam Savage. He's like, just get this big roll of plastic of paper and just write on it. So passive speakers, I have these Bucart S400s. You could have speakers as cheap as 50 bucks. These are like $1,800. All you got to know is there's usually just 2 terminals in the back, and you need to power these. This is the only passive one. All these other types of speakers have amplifiers built into them. That means when adding a sub, it's going to be a little bit different, as you're going to have to either interrupt the signal or completely work around it. So the first one is passive. We'll get to the different setups for that. The second one that's probably the most common will be studio monitors. Studio monitors like these iLoud MTMs are powered individually, signaled individually, which means that they're usually for studio setups, and you would use something else to feed signal and control it. And the problem with that is you have to, if you want to add a sub to something like this, it gets a little bit more complicated. So that's studio monitor, studio monitors. The next setup I'm gonna call basic, not smart speaker, but like a self-powered, basic self-powered. And this set is the Audiophile MR4. Basic self-powered. And basic self-powered speakers basically means that they accept an analog signal of some form, and they have their own amplifier, and this amplifier feeds to that speaker, which looks like a passive, because it is, and it just, this is the left channel, that's the right channel, or vice versa, and we only get to control signals in. So that makes it either easier or harder to hook up a sub. We'll get to it. The next setup would be like an advanced self-powered. And these are usually more expensive. Powered. Apparently I can't write and speak at the same time because I don't do that often. And an advanced self-powered, very similar to this, where we have one passive speaker here, which is just getting power. But instead of having just analog inputs, this type of speaker, which this is a triangle AIO twin, has optical inputs, phono inputs. It's got, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And this particular one has a sub out, which is gonna make it real easy because you're gonna plug a sub into that. But if it didn't have this sub out, how would you get a speaker like this to work with a subwoofer? Just finished Grace Pretender. That was the thing finishing. And the final and last one, I wasn't sure if I was going to add this because I'm not sure if even my knowledge base will be able to explain how to do this. It's going to require some theoretical stuff. Is Bluetooth, straight Bluetooth speakers. Bluetooth wireless, that's it. These are the Minirigs, Minirig 3s. So they actually have outputs. But when that's not the case, when you just have a standard, Bose Cube or some other thing, they're is ways to do it, but it's going to involve some fuckery. That's just going to start with that. Like, it's not like, oh, just add a sub. So these are the 5 basic types of speakers. Probably the most common being passive, and then the other 4 all have amplifiers built into them. So we'll leave it at that. Now I've gathered up a tower of 5 different subwoofers from my house. There are more here, it's just I don't feel like bringing them upstairs, especially the rhythmic. And the reason that there's so many different subs here is because there's so many different connections you're going to find in the back. One of the biggest problems is someone will say, I have this setup, I want to buy this sub, and that sub doesn't work. For example, this giant $1,000 clip on the bottom here, the only way to get signal into this are these 2 RCA ports. That's it. That's all it's got for options. 2 RCA ports in. And then you move up to something really nice like this Airmotive, which has RCA ins and outs and speaker terminals and a separate LFE port. We've got this Mackie MR-S10, which is specifically designed for studio monitors. So we have XLR ins and outs and TRS ins and outs. So that's very specific for doing things with powered monitors. We'll hook all this stuff up to show you what it does. I brought out the Dynamo 400 Martin Logan, which has just 2 RCAs, but then also 4 speaker pass-throughs. But these are interesting speaker pass-throughs. And then finally up here, we have the SVS, what is this? The Micro 3000, which has RCA inputs and outputs, but no speaker terminals. So that's sort of like the most basic. And it's going to be a little bit harder to do this in sort of like a passive form. So I will now, we got to talk about sources for a second, because, hi, internet, lots of waifus. Depending on where you're trying to set this up, like maybe you have, the easiest way to do this would be like, oh, I have a computer, I have computer speakers, I want to add a subwoofer to my computer speakers. So then you have options of USB output, usually a fiber optic output. If we're talking about a TV setup, then you're going to be sort of limited to just a fiber optic output and no other options to add devices. There's also things like maybe you want to add a setup to an analog thing. You have a turntable and an old vintage receiver, and you want to add a subwoofer to that setup, and that would be another schematic to do that. So what I'm going to do is, I guess I'll bring, we'll do passive first, since it's the first in the list and has the fewest ways to go about doing things. The real complicated stuff comes when we're into like the smart speakers that use fiber optic inputs, or subwoofers that if you need to split DACs. All right, we're going to get to it. And please, again, use the timestamps below or in the description to jump to whatever setup. I'll try to title them as best as I can so that you know exactly what I'm doing and when I'm doing it. So I guess we're just gonna, we're gonna start now. All right, so this right now is basically the most basic speaker setup I could think of. 2 passive speakers, a very, very standard amplifier, audio source in via RCAs. This is the signal. Our source is being represented by this Neo IDSD from IFI. This could be a turntable, a CD player, your computer's analog output. Just that's doing the thing. If you don't know how this stuff works, I'm going to try to ELI 5 best I can. This is your source. This is where the music's coming from. If it was a 3.5 millimeter, it would be a 3.5 millimeter. These are analog cables. They're signal cables. The signal cables go into this box. The box is the amplifier. It takes the low-level signals, it amplifies them to be powerful enough to run the speakers. So now, getting a subwoofer into this setup has several options. Trying to think what the easiest would be. Because if you want to, it's going to come down to a lot of the times of controlling the volume. Because you can literally put splitters off of this source and just have 2 RCAs. 1 RCA go to this amp and 1 RCA go to the sub. Then they're both going to work. The problem is, if this is constant and you're using the volume knob on this controls the speakers, the sub is independent at that point. So if you lowered the speaker volume down on this amplifier, the subwoofer doesn't know you're doing that. So that is a possibility and can be okay if This is where you're controlling the volume. You would set the speaker amp volume, you would set the sub volume so they level out and match, and then you'd never touch those volume controls again and control your source. With something like this, you can actually do that. It's a knob. If you were hooking this up to a computer, if you were to like lower your master volume in Windows, or if your TV has analog outputs and you would lower that, then that's fine. That is an absolutely capable thing. In fact, let me show you what that would look like. So here I have some Amazon Basic splitters. They plug in male RCA into the source, and you get two female sides. So you need more RCAs, one to go to the amplifier and one set, I'm using Amazon Basics again, to go up to a subwoofer. And the only limitation with this is you need a subwoofer with two RCA inputs. I actually do not have a subwoofer here that has only one. Very cheap subs, usually back in the day, 10 years old, would have literally one RCA. These are RCAs, by the way. This sort of LFE input. If you have one RCA input, it's nearly impossible to do anything with a subwoofer without adding in another piece of hardware and controlling it like with a MiniDSP. We'll get to that at some point in the future of these time jumps. But for now, this is one way to do it. Once you have a setup like this, you're now taking your source, and now your source has to control the volume. So if you can't control your volumes at the source, if you can't control your Windows volume, you don't want to like raise and lower your volumes on, you know, Fubar, Winamp, or Spotify, and you want to still use the volume on the amplifier, the way you would hook it up would be as follows. Okay, so now I've reset this back to having just the source coming out, going into our power amplifier or integrated amplifier, anything with a volume knob here. So what I'm doing is I've added some raw wire to share the speaker output. Now, a lot of people have a misconception. They think that the subwoofer, because I'm wiring the subwoofer to the amp is powering the subwoofer. Every modern subwoofer is self-powered. If it requires 110 volts to the wall, or if you're in Europe, 220, if it requires power to be plugged in individually, these will power themselves. All we have to do is get the signal level from either RCA or the speaker outs to the sub, and it'll do the rest. So I've got some raw speaker wire screwed into the 5-way binding posts on this particular Emotiva. For example, this has also speaker levels in that could be used, but the SVS does not. There's no way to get this SVS to work in this configuration. You'd have to split your signal source or have a source with multiple outputs and send to speaker amp and to the sub and then control on that end of it. So, and if you use the smallest, shittiest gauge wire, if you feel like it, you're just gonna let the subwoofer taste what the amplifier is doing. So the amplifier is still hooked up individually to each speaker, but at the same time, at the same power level, it's showing the subwoofer, hey, through these little wires, this is what I'm doing. So you set the subwoofer to match, and when you raise and lower the volume on the amplifier, the subwoofer will go up and down with it, and everything is good. This is probably one of my favorite ways to integrate a subwoofer into a system, because again, it follows that and everything sort of like is cohesive. The only problem is getting either, because I'm using banana plugs on these are mica cables. And if you have smaller terminals, you have something like this, an amplifier box that uses very small 5-way binding posts. It can be much more difficult to get both a banana and a threaded wire in there. If you're using standard speaker wire, you can just twist two of them together and put them into a single thing and lock it down, which is, again, you could use a larger gauge for the actual speakers and a smaller gauge for the tasting wires for the sub. That works perfectly fine. Just make sure you don't ground anything out. What else am I thinking of with this? I am not hooking up power or demonstrating any of these, by the way, because A, I think the tower would fall down, and B, be too many wires. Right now, there's already enough wires. Everyone's probably going, oh my God. So yeah, the two ways to get signal to a sub, either from the source split, you lock the volume on this, you lock the volume in that, control here, or source is just consistent. You control the volume with this, but you have to send speaker power to the sub, and the sub has to have inputs, either like this or like this. These are just very, very small. Probably the only sub I've ever seen that has the actual just banana inputs. But a sub like the SVS will not work like this, certainly not this MRS-10, and the big clip is just wanting RCAs. So I think that's the only way to do this. Give me a second, let me just double check. All right, so I wrote down RCA signal split and then speaker wire split are the two ways that I figured out to do that passive setup. However, if we go even further back down the line, assuming that you are sending a digital signal to this whole setup, you could split even further back before, in that case, that's a DAC, that's a digital to analog converter. But if you had a fiber optic line, like this, say coming from your television, depending on what box you're plugging that into, could solve a lot of your problems. Some of these, do I actually have just a straight DAC with a remote? I don't have a straight remote DAC. One second. Okay, now this is going to be the rarest of occasions, and you probably don't want to do this, but I'm going to include it because I'm trying to make sure comments are like, you could have also done this. A digital split plus a cheap DAC. So now we're starting to add hardware to this mix. So what I've done is I've used this box over here to represent our source, and our source is outputting a fiber optic cable, you know, this with the red light that usually glows. So if this is our digital source, putting into our analog converter, digital to analog converter, and then that is outputting analog to this, and then that's doing its whole powering routine. Should you need to, for whatever reason, you can add one of these. This is a very cheap $30, or actually probably less than $30, a FIO DAC. DAC just means digital analog converter. But what you could do is add one of these. Say you had a subwoofer that didn't have any ability to put speaker wires. So here will be our input. Please don't fall down, giant tower of expensive subwoofers. Thank you. So now we have now basically using this FIO D3 and these short cables, made it so that this subwoofer can accept a digital signal. This is going to accept a digital signal and it's going to amplify it. So now we would bypass this unit and this unit and split off of the actual source. So this would be a laptop. I wouldn't recommend this for anything that you have no volume control. This is something you have to have either a Windows computer with Windows volume control, or you'll be using, you know, Spotify or something on like an, I don't know if Apple TVs, things like that have the ability to control the volume at their source. But if they did, what you would do is then get one of these like cheap digital splitters. They cost literally nothing. They're like $15, which has one input and then up to 6 outputs. So it has 3 outputs. So what you would end up doing is I would steal this. Here, I'm going to rearrange this real quick. Since you're way up here and far away, we're gonna give you the long one. So now this would get a digital signal. We would put it into the splitter. This short one, we'd put into our digital signal. And then our original source here, whether that's a laptop, a computer, a home theater PC, which is the same thing. So now this is outputting fiber optic stereo. It's coming down the line, that's getting split. The stereo is going into this digital to analog converter for the speaker amp, for the speakers, and it's going up to this digital to analog converter just for the sub. Now, this is back to that same scenario where you would set the volume of your speakers here, set the volume of your sub here, and never touch those again. You would have to control it before it leaves this box, because or else it would just be full volume all the time. But that is the third method. You get far enough up the system so that it's like, all right, one fiber optic cable turns into 2 fiber optic cables, into a digital to analog converter, into another digital analog converter. You lock the volume on that, you lock the volume on this. No other wires are required. You would forget about anything to do with this. It would just be 2, 1, and then the split happens before that. So that's I don't even know why you'd want to do that, but this is going to come up a few times in the future just because sometimes splitting to a digital is a lot easier and cleaner than splitting the analogs. So I think we've covered this type of amplifier. I'm going to leave the passes up for a second and we're going to switch to some different amplifiers and I'll go over those. So the cheat mode for this category is you buy an amplifier with a subwoofer out. Any surround sound receiver, 5-channel, 7-channel, any of those will have a dedicated single RCA subwoofer out. At least a single, sometimes they have two. And luckily for us, there are smaller units, like desk size units, like this. This is the SMSL DA9, and it has our speaker terminal outs, and right here, a single RCA output that says subwoofer out. And all that's doing is taking the signal that's going to the speakers, summing it into an RCA, you get full volume control. You literally can plug the single RCA into any subwoofer that has RCAs, which this one doesn't, because that's a specific one for powered monitors, but LFE, if you see an LFE in, which is usually a standalone, or one of the plugs is labeled left in, then right in plus LFE, this now becomes the subwoofer we're using with this setup, or this becomes a subwoofer using this setup. This is the cheat mode if you have an amplifier that has a subwoofer out. You've now seen, if you've watched this whole section, you're like, well, shit, I'm buying that type of amplifier. There are few and far between. I know the Lox GA30 has it. I know this one has it. And it just takes your analog inputs, whether they're RCA or balanced. We're going to get to balanced. But that's the ultimate easy. If you're not using the standard power amp, you have like a slightly more advanced amplifier, something that like this, adding a subwoofer is a piece of cake. We should probably talk about cutoff frequencies. The best way to integrate a subwoofer, which is not going to be possible on any of this stuff except for when I get to the MiniDSP. Ideally, you would have your speakers play, and then when the low end starts, the stuff that the subwoofer should be taking over, you would want them to not play that. So let's say you wanted your speakers to stop at 70 hertz, where 20 hertz is like ground shaking. Most speakers will stop around 50, 55. So if you wanted to take 70 and below and push it to the subwoofer, you're shit out of luck for most of these setups, because they're just going to get full range. The speakers are going to keep playing everything. They're going to try to go as low as possible. And then you would just balance in, using the knobs, both the frequency response, so you'd match the speakers that way, and then the gain, you'd match it by ear. That's the only real way to do it. And you hope for the best. When you use a surround sound receiver, you get the options in the menu to cut off the frequency to the speakers and add those frequencies down to the sub. With most of these setups, that is not possible. So with higher end systems, I know that Buchart $2,600 amplifier has a subwoofer out and can do those cutoffs, but any standard cheap surround sound receiver can also do that. If you want that sort of control, buying a surround receiver is just fine. A lot of people want slightly better amplification, which is why separates like this come in real handy. So now, do we have another type of speaker amp? This has speaker outs, but at the same time, it doesn't have a sub out, so it's the same problems you would have with the big Emotiva and the straight powered stuff. I think we're ready to move off of passives and onto the studio monitors. So let's see how we hook those up. Okay, so now things with self-powered monitors has gotten a little bit simpler. The amplifier, instead of being a separate unit out here, is built into the speakers. Again, you're only seeing the signal cables going in, not the power cables. There'd be too many fucking cables to deal with. With self-powered studio monitors, you need to control the signal at the source. You're gonna have to. I'm using this IFI Nano, Neo, not Nano. IFI Neo to represent that. It has a volume knob and it has XLR outputs. If you don't want to use XLR outputs, if you just have a standard DAC, this is another example of that. This, what are you, the topping E50? This has RCA outputs. You can use RCA inputs on most studio monitors. You would buy these adapters, these 1/4 inch TS adapters. They're not TRS. And you would simply plug them in, or you can buy wires that are pre-terminated like this, so that one end is a standard RCA, the other end is 1/4 inch, and then you would simply, this uses a combined port, so you would be like this. There you go, performing the same task at a slightly lower voltage, but you have the options. Now, no matter which way you hook up the speakers to your source, and your source, again, if you wanted to, you could get, let me put this stuff down for a second, hold on. all the things down. I mean, if you want to go real simple, one of these 3.5 millimeter to RCAs could be used to run powered monitors. You would simply stretch this apart as wide as the speakers are apart, plug this into the headphone jack of your laptop, you're done. So adding a subwoofer to this setup gets interesting. Since we can't access the space between the amplifier and the speaker, it all has to happen in the signal realm. So if we have XLRs like this, and you have a sub like this MRS10, this has XLR ins and outs. So you would unplug, well, I'm gonna unplug that for a second. You would simply plug these into here, and then get another set of XLRs and go from here into the speakers, and you're done. Do I actually have another set of XLRs? I only brought one set up from the basement. So you would then just put this in the middle. This is specifically designed for studio monitors. It interrupts and puts it down. I do not believe it will do the same thing with the crossover where it blocks it. Some of them do, more expensive ones do. This one I don't believe does that. Also, in case you're wondering, yes, this will also take either TRS balanced or TRR, hold on, or this type coming over here. So the adapters we put on this RCA are a tip and ring, or tip and ground. You can put a stereo one on there, which is tip and ring and ground, and that actually connects it to a standard XLR, which makes it a balanced connection. Balanced connections, for those of you who are wondering, simply have slightly more voltage and a little bit of error correction. They're designed for use in professional studios. If you ever go see Metallica, they're using XLRs to run 70-foot cables because it sends an up voltage and a down voltage, and it cancels out any weirdness along the way. You really don't need a lot of that in a home environment where the runs are short. But a lot of professional equipment, certainly in studio monitors, run basically solely on XLRs. So you can run speaker wires or TRS wires like this, or use adapters on standard RCA cables like that to run something in and out. So now, we've added a sub, we've added this type of sub. Honestly, I don't recommend buying this type of sub for almost any application, because for some reason, companies that make them, whether it's Mackie or JBL or Adam, all those companies, when you add a subwoofer that is specifically designed for studio monitors, they like to rip you off. You can get way more performance for the same money. I think this subwoofer is $400, and like this Airmotive SE12 is $400, and this subwoofer will kill this subwoofer in performance. This $500 8-inch will kill the subwoofer performance. Of all these 5 subs, this is the least powerful. You're paying extra for the weird specific connectors that make your life easier. But we can still use all these other subs. It's just up to the matter of our source equipment. So I'm gonna drop some wires down and some knowledge. In fact, I'm gonna unplug these adapters. We're gonna take these RCAs back. And RCAs don't have to be special. You don't have to buy specific subwoofer RCAs. Any RCA cable will work. Just make sure it's not a giant pile of crap that came with like an old DVD player and it'll actually carry signal. So we're in a good scenario here because the source I'm using, this IFI Neo, has XLR outputs and simultaneously has RCA outputs. So look how easy it is to add a subwoofer like this. We just go here and then we go here. Oh, actually, which way's in? No, it's fine. Doesn't matter for the purposes of this video. Congratulations, you've just added a subwoofer to powered monitors. So depending on what type of, in this case, this is a DAC with a volume control. It actually has a remote control too. It could be that easy. It could just be you have 4 outputs, 2 for speakers, 2 that aren't used usually, plug it into a sub. Again, you need a sub with 2 inputs, left and right. If you have a sub with 1 input, yes, you can do this, but it's only gonna subwoofer 1 channel, which gets real fucking weird. So that is like the most basic, in fact, this unit over here, which is much cheaper, the Topping E50, has RCA outs, and then next to it has the outputs that accept these balance connectors. This is becoming more common on smaller devices because they want to save space. So in that case, you would send these to your powered monitors and use the RCAs for your sub. Same like this $700+ unit. I really wish it was able to stand on this stand much better. Perfect. So much cheaper unit. Instead of spending $700, you spend something like this. You get a volume control. You have to control the volume here. I can control the volume here. I can control the volume here with a remote control. There's no touch interface for it, so it gets a little bit weirder on a desk. But that's basically it. And this unit has fiber optic input, and this unit has fiber optic input. So it would work on a television. Most televisions, I hesitate to say all televisions, but I know most televisions simply have fiber optic outputs. So if you stream to your TV is a smart TV, you watch Amazon on it, you load up the YouTube app, this will work perfect. This is done. You set your, you put those where you want to put them. You set your settings in the back. A lot of studio monitors have, room correction settings. In this case, you would actually be able to lower how much low end is going to these and cut it out. Sometimes it's just a switch plus or minus, and you would just tune it however you feel needed and bring the sub in to match, just fill it in. Actually calibrating a subwoofer, that's a whole other video. Right now, I'm just showing you how you could hook it up. So there's a couple other ways. Let me write this down, and then we'll see what the other ways to do it. Okay, so I basically filled in all the options for the studio monitors. Essentially, using the 4 outputs is the same as using an RCA or XLR splitter. If your DAC only has one set of outputs, and it's RCA, you could do the same thing we did before. Get an RCA splitter, run 2 RCAs, 2 adapters to the speakers, and run 2 RCAs to a sub. Remember, you need 2. And that's it, you're good to go. They're both getting the same signal, you're both being able to be quelled at the same time, you're solid. You could do the full digital split and cheap DAC that I showed you in the previous section. If you haven't seen the previous section, go back and look at that on the passive. It's the exact same thing. Remember, a studio monitor has the amplifiers built into it. So all you have to do is take the amplifiers and pretend they're in the single box, and we're back to the same setup. Buying a studio sub obviously corrects any issues you have. You just run XLRs or TRS connectors in, you run them out, you're good to go. That involves buying a specific type of sub, which I, again, don't usually recommend. They're usually overpriced and underperform. The last section, and this is going to be a long one and slightly complicated because it took me like 40 minutes to describe how good a MiniDSP is on its solo review. So the MiniDSP, and this would also somehow work into the passive, is this box here. Hubba hubba. A MiniDSP, or digital signal processor, would take over from this unit here completely. We would have to, in fact, we'd have to do this. Before I move on to the MiniDSP proper setup, I just wanted to remind everyone, you can use these same RCA splitters. I switched these to RCA inputs with the adapters. This has RCA inputs. These Amazon basic splitters simply give you a way to have signal bounce from here through the left, split the left from here and there, and split the right from there to there, and this will work. This will absolutely work. As long as both the speakers and the sub, and this will again work in any sub that has RCA inputs, or if you really wanted to, you could use the adapters on that, and there's too much. If your DAC only had a single, this particular one happens to have both balanced and RCA, but if it didn't, if you were using a cheaper lower end DAC or just a better DAC, but doesn't have multiple outputs, splitters are okay. Say it with me, everyone. Signal splitters are okay. Just make sure they're of quality and not like $2. Actually, I think I got these for like 50 cents a piece because no one wanted to buy them. But this is their perfect use case. You have male ends and 2 female ends, and then you just take both your, these are both of your right channels, and both your, actually no, these are both our right channels, and these are both the left channels, and they go and do their respective things. So now let's get into the more complicated MiniDSP aspect of this, where we're gonna actually control the sub using a whole process. All right, if you are serious about getting your system set up, more to the point than just I added a sub and it got more bass. If you actually want to tune the frequencies going to your monitors, powered monitors, this would also work again with the amplifier, with a straight big block amplifier. You would just have 2 of these go to the amplifier and then the other 2 go to your sub, or 2 subs. You can do a 2.2 with this. The MiniDSP is a magical fucking box, all right? basically you can send it a fiber optic, pretending this is our source, and I've got it hooked up with fiber optic. So this has a fiber optic input, sending it 2 channels. I've also got this RCA input, sending it 2 channels. You could also have a USB micro set into it to plug into your computer, which will use it as an audio device that'll send it 2 channels. And you could switch between all of those things on the software. This requires you to have access to a computer plugged into it, and then you can program it, and then it has an infrared receiver that doesn't come with a remote control, but you could literally take any remote control that has an infrared blaster and teach it. So real quick, because I could just spend 4 hours talking about the MiniDSP, what this allows you to do is take the input signals, the left and right, whether it's from fiber optic, USB, or analog, and break them, move them, chop them up, put them anywhere you want. You could literally plug these wires in randomly. Doesn't matter, left, right, they're not labeled. They're only labeled out 1 through 4. And in the software, say, okay, left channel coming from the fiber optic, put it to outputs 1 and outputs 4, which could literally have the 2 reds next to each other. And then you say, okay, this one, these 2 are for a subwoofer. So I want you to put a low pass filter so that only 50 hertz and below goes to that on this sort of slope. And then set the volume, 3 decibels down. And then have the left and right speakers, you could have it, okay, only 50 hertz and above. Oh, but you know what? It really has a room peak at like 5,000, so we're going to just trim that down. And then you save up to 4 different profiles. So you could, with the remote control, you program a remote control. They sell one online, but it's not worth it. Just buy like a Samsung remote or something. You could then have it so that you could switch buttons with the remote and say, I want to listen to the fiber optic. I want to listen to the RCA. I want to listen to the USB. I want to listen to profile 1, which is the 2.1. I want to listen to profile 2, which shuts off the sub and full ranges the speakers. I want to listen to profile 3, which is just a sub, because I loves bass. I want to listen to profile 4, which reverses the stereo channels and makes the subwoofer 10 times louder. You can do that with this box. It's a $200 box, but it acts as your DAC, your controller. You then get a volume control inside. You could raise and lower the volume based on that. However, there is no screen, so you don't know what the volume is. So it sort of leaves you guessing. It's beautiful if you can have a computer next to it and run software all the time, but you can program it with the software, disconnect it from a computer, never plug it into a computer ever again. I ran my whole living room off of one of these for over a year. And while the DAC component isn't the most expensive DAC, the ability to adjust frequency response curves and delays. If you have the sub further away in a corner, you could add a delay to the speakers. I think this up's up to 9 milliseconds, so you can do timing adjustments. This thing is insane. And this is a perfect scenario for it. And like I said, if you use the LFE in on not 1, but 2 subs, you can just go whoop and plug 1 in and then tell this, okay, left sub, right sub, play in stereo, play in mixed mono. Maybe one has more capabilities. You could do timing delays to line up the subs. This is dumb. This is dumb. This is the, I need a sub and this will fix that problem. Because remember when I said you couldn't use a subwoofer with a single RCA input? With this you can, because you would literally just only plug in 1 of these and then only have it in the LFE in, and then in the software tell it to take the left and right channel, sum them to mono, put it through this output, and then control it. Done. They do actually sell a balanced version. I've never used that one, but it has much more. You have to actually wire in special connectors, but then it'll do that. Now you have there's a digital version which requires you to use a DAC for every channel, and I don't think they sell that one anymore, the Nano Digi, which is unfortunate. But yeah, this is the I need a sub and I can't make one go fix it box, because it'll do that. It's just inconvenient that it doesn't have a display and you have to buy a remote, and then you can program the remote to have the switch inputs, mute, volume, different profiles. So yeah, that's the cheat box. If you ever have a problem and you need to put a sub in something, cheat box. Moving on. Previously to moving on, I also added preamp to the studio monitor list, and this would also sort of apply for passive. This is a Shit Magnus, which is a headphone amplifier. So you feed it analog signals, and it also has outputs for analog signals. So you input here, whether it's RCA or XLR, and it gives you 4 outputs, which you know what to do with that. You put the 2 XLRs to your powered monitors, your powered studio monitors, you put the 2 RCAs to your sub, and then your volume control here would control both of them. Ideally, as long as they're both being controlled from a single spot, that's good. So I could use this on pretty much any of these setups. You could plug a speaker amp into this, like for passive speakers. You would just have to, again, set the volume on the speaker amp, never touch it again, control everything through this. So just making sure I point that out for people who have dedicated headphone setups. If you have an amplifier with dedicated inputs and outputs and you have 4 of them, even if you only have 2 of them, the splitters work. The RCA splitters work wonders. So now moving on to basic self-powered stuff. All right, for the purposes of this demonstration, assume that this speaker is wired with a speaker wire over to that. There's no way to intercept and use the 5-way terminals on a subwoofer, or you'd only get 1 channel's bass, which might be fine, but it would be your left channel's bass only, and if anything happened on the right, it wouldn't be amplified. So assume this is plugged in power, and assume that there's a speaker wire going across. That means you only are dealing with the 2 RCA inputs on the speaker. So back to our old friend, the RCA splitter. We have both the right channels going, one right there, and actually on a subwoofer when you're plugging it in, doesn't matter. There's only 1 driver. These subwoofers only have 1 speaker. There's no left and right. So it doesn't matter if you put the left and the right or the right and the left, it's gonna put it to mono and power the subwoofer regardless. But it does matter on the speakers, you don't wanna have them be backwards. Alternatively, if you have your source, and again, I'm representing, that's whatever's playing music digitally over there, giving us fiber optic, comes over to a DAC like this topping, gives us 2 RCA outputs. You're gonna need something that gives you RCA. Again, this could be something as simple as a 3.5mm out of an old iPod Classic. And then that would just be, instead of going there, you would have this plugged into here through barrel connectors or whatever you need to do. I'm just using this as a representation. As long as you can control the volume here. No, wait, I'm wrong. Forget that. Strike the whole thing. Now, because we're into I would almost call them smart speakers, we have volume controls here. So the problem is, if you're raising and lowering the volume here, what's telling the sub what to do? So now we're back, because that's another thing. It's the same as the volume on the amplifier. The studio monitors are not designed, these powered studio monitors are not designed to have volume controls. They have gain adjustments in the back, you set them once and you leave them. It has to have the control here. With something like an edifier or anything that has a volume knob, you're gonna have to set it and forget it. Because the only way you could integrate a subwoofer in is if this is set and that is set and you control the volume elsewhere. So we're back to needing a DAC or using the analog outputs of an iPod and lowering the physical volume there. Another option you have, if you don't want to use the splitters, because with this sub, the Martin Logan Dynamo, you have to use the splitters. It only has a single set of RC ins. But this SVS has inputs and outputs. This Airmotive SE12 has inputs and outputs. This only has 1 set of inputs, so you're forced to use the splitters. However, we can do this with the other subs. Even cleaner installation, no splitters involved, RCA output of our source, digital input into a DAC of some sort. You still have to control the volume here, even using this method. But subwoofers like the SVS I don't believe has this capability, but the Emotiva does, where there's a switch here that actually lets you cut off the frequency going to the speakers. Remember that thing we couldn't do? This subwoofer has that built in. So we have our source going into these are backwards. We have our source going into the in, and our speakers plugged into the out. Again, for the purpose of this test, it didn't matter, but I'm OCD and I have to make us show it. So here are our Amazon Basics RCAs feeding this subwoofer signal. The subwoofer is taking it, doing its thing, and it's outputting, thanks to the switch, either 60, 80, or 100 hertz back to the edifiers. These edifiers being so small, how much of the sound do you want to give to the subwoofer? That's what that switch would determine. So that's a very unique feature for the Airmotive SE12. Most subs don't have that. And I mean like 99% of subwoofers do not have the capability to edit the signal. But I mean, that's about as basic a setup as you're ever gonna get. RCA from source in, RCA out. You can flip the switch and let whatever go out to this, and then you adjust your fine tuning of phase, and oh, we could talk about phase in another video. But yeah, you could adjust your sub to match the edifiers and you're done. So that would also work for several of the other setups we did. With studio monitors, it would also work. It would basically, RCA or XLR split. I'd have to add a thing here that says double RCA sub. So if you have a double RCA sub. If you have a double RCA sub like the SE12 or like the SVS, I won't count the MSR10s, but if you have two in and out, instead of using the splitter wires, you can just run it in and out. No splitters needed. It's convenience. This clip could easily have 4 RCAs, 2 in and 2 out. The same as this Martin Logan. It could just have another set. They just didn't give it to you. SVS gives it to you, Amotiva gives it to you, Klipsch doesn't, and Martin Logan doesn't. When they don't give it to you, you buy these. I will link them in the description. These are really nice, by the way. They're males into 2 females. This becomes your splitter. You just have to have an extra set of RCA wires to hook it all up. This takes the place of having to do that. You don't have to worry about it. Buy these, be done. Or do this if you have the right sub. Yeah, so the basic ones that just take, the ones that are self-powered and just take an RCA input, again, it's all about just like, this is a set of passive speakers, the amplifier is a separate box. This is a set of speakers with the amplifiers built in. That's a set of speakers with the amplifiers built in. This is gonna be a set of speakers with the amplifiers built in. We'll switch to these next. So RCA signal split, use splitters, work great. Or get a sub with a double input and output. You can still do the digital split with the cheap DAC. Again, I don't know why you'd want to do that. MiniDSP, always an option. Isn't that strange that it's always an option? And I wrote preamp, yeah, because since you have to control, once you add a sub, you can no longer use the volume that is built into the speakers. You have to set the volume on the speakers and never touch it again. And if you shut the speakers off and turn it on and the volume resets, you're shit out of luck. So you might want to keep an eye on which speakers you're buying, because most times powered speakers like that use almost no power in standby. Just leave it on. Leave it on 24 hours a day. If you have to turn it off and back on again, if the volume if that's an analog knob, you literally set it and it doesn't move. Digital speakers, or speakers that have like a click remote button, you're at volume 5, you gotta be at volume 8 to match the sub. You're gonna have a little bit more of a difficult time doing a sub match, but that's just the way it works. And the preamp would work because, again, even if you can't use the 4 outputs because you're not gonna have XLR for them, just using the splitters on a preamp and controlling the volume with that. Or go directly to your computer and control the volume with the master on the computer. So as long as you can control the volume, all of these things require you to be able to control the volume. The only time you can use the volume on the amplifier itself is in a passive setup using the speaker wire. Passive setup with a speaker wire, you can use the volume on your amp. I should also mention for that, and I didn't mention it when I was doing it, and now it's gonna be lost in this video. If you have an older amplifier with A and B channel amplification, this is for passive speakers, you would put channel A on your speakers and channel B you could wire into the sub directly. So you could just use another set of banana plugged wires, and this way you could just turn on speaker B when you want the sub to join in, turn it off when you don't want it to join in, and there'd be no changing levels between it, but that would be another super easy way to do it. I didn't bring out any vintage amplifiers for this example. I apologize. So okay, basic is done. Let's move on to advanced. Well, now we're on to the advanced self-powered speakers and how tragically simple this is. Literally, the speaker will take your fiber optic input or your analog input and give you a sub out. This particular set is like $1,000 pair, but there are cheaper self-powered, remote controlled, volume control on the front, knobbed speakers that just have a sub out, like that amplifier we talked about in the passives. So that's it. You plug one RCA into the speaker, you're done. That's pretty boring. That said, subwoofer outs are not guaranteed on an advanced self-powered. So now we have to go into some more figuring. So one second. Okay, so basically direct copy all the colors over RCA signal split, double sub, same thing. What you'd essentially have to do with a advanced sub, if it doesn't have a subwoofer out, is you can't use a digital input. You can use a digital input. You'd have to do the thing where you get the fiber optic splitter and then again control to the source. Once you buy one of these speakers that doesn't have a sub out, you have to take away the volume control from the speaker to integrate a sub properly. So which means you're going to be going with your preamps, you're going to be going with your DACs, you're going to be using the analog inputs and not the digital inputs. It also has the unfortunate effect that if you're using Bluetooth to these smart speakers and you don't have a sub out on the speaker, there's no way to get to that. I mean, I'm going to touch on it in the Bluetooth speaker thing in a second, which please hold on or check the timestamps. That's going to be a wild ride. But yeah, that's basically what we're down to. You're just going to have to ignore your digital inputs and only use analog, and then it just becomes like every other speaker on the planet Earth. Again, concerning ourselves with the volume, if you turn these speakers off and turn them back on, if the volume resets lower, because these are all digital, the volume knobs spin, 360 degrees, so you'd have to figure out how to make it so that your subwoofer matches to the speakers when you turn it on. Honestly, if you're interested in something like this, like Swans, Audiophiles, Swans do not allow, there's no sub outs on Swans. So you'd have to do something like this or get the MiniDSP to do the signal with the 4-way, 2 there, and then 2 to a sub or 1 to each sub. So you have as many options as you do in everything else, but buying a speaker with a sub out, probably your best bet with this. But if you bought something that wasn't these triangle AIO twins with the sub out, you bought Swans and you want to add sub to your Swans in your living room because you want that little bit extra, it's going to require you to either do a split cable, control the volume on a DAC remotely, or on a analog preamp, you have to take the control away from the speakers. You have to go back to just analog inputs, and then it'll work fine. You just can never shut your speakers off, or if the volume resets, know exactly how to set it back to where it needs to be, whether you max it out and then control it with the remote control and the alternative unit. You could plug one of these in. Some of these speakers, some of these more advanced self-powered speakers like Swans, like Audiophiles, like more expensive Audiophiles, like the Triangles. What else is out there? The Alaras. I'm trying to think of other Vanitus, Canto Tux. Those are all considered advanced self-powered speakers. They're not studio monitors. They're not basic ones. They all have digital inputs. Once you have a digital input, it puts it in like a separate category. And you could still do all these things. The MiniDSP. If the MiniDSP Nano Digi still existed, you could then do like I explained the MiniDSP could do, but then send a digital signal there and a digital signal to the hanging little cheap, where's the cheap DAC? Little cheap DAC. And then you could do the same thing where you're doing the crossovers and everything. But the MiniDSP Nano Digi seems to have evaporated from the earth, and I'm very sad about it. So yeah, those have, cheap splitter, MiniDSP, preamp. Once you take away its ability to control the volume on itself, you can add a sub. That's the biggest problem, is you have to take away. It comes with this beautiful remote. Oh, I can't wait to use this remote to raise and lower the volume. You can't anymore. You've got to switch to, there's another remote for that topping, but you would just be like raise and lower the remote on the source beforehand, or raise and lower it on the computer beforehand. It has to just move the volume control further back so that both the sub and speakers get controlled at the same time. So now I think we've covered everything with this sort of setup. This is one of the, probably the most popular, but it really, once you're going fiber optic or digital input, all you can do is split it, and you still have to control it beforehand. Or use the splitters in and out of the subs or the double RCAs. So now I'm going to talk about Bluetooth, and that's going to be trip. So hold on. So for my subwoofer example on Bluetooth, these are the Minirig 3s, and the first note I put if you want to add a subwoofer to a Bluetooth speaker is buy Minirigs, because this is the only company that I could think of. Is that rust? No, it's dirt. The only company that I know of that you can actually just plug a wire in and it will output, and you can hook that to their proprietary sub, which by the way just turned on when you plugged it in, and boom, we've added specifically that sub to specifically the speaker. Now you can use the 3.5 millimeter to RCA cable, which I think I've done this once before. You could add this cable to a mini rig, and then you get RCAs, and you could plug this directly into any one of those subs, and then you would have, you know, the world's most powerful bass Bluetooth speaker, because you could hook it up to anything. But assuming you're not going to be able to just buy, yeah, please go to sleep, buy specifically the mini rigs, we have to work out some other stuff. So if you want to add a sub to a Bluetooth speaker, or speakers in this case, because these will pair in a pair. They pair in the stereo pair. This is the FIO of BTA 30 Pro, and I haven't reviewed it yet. But this little box basically can either send or receive Bluetooth, and you pick the options here, or act as a DAC, and plug it directly into a computer. And then this has multiple things in the back of it. It has a line outs, RCA, it has optical outs, and it has coaxial in and out, and it has USB. So the only thing I could think to do with this, and my brain is just clicking away going click, click, click. I don't know if it'll even do it. But the only way I could think of it working would be to have these RCA line outs hooked to a sub directly, or the fiber optic out hooked to the little cheap DAC, and then that hooked to the sub directly. And then this being on output to then connect to the speakers, and then use either the RCA outputs or the fiber optic outputs or something else to connect to that. I haven't tested this. This is all theoretical. But if everything worked simultaneously, like I don't know if the line outs here, which are controllable here, would go on at the same time as the actual Bluetooth outputting. And then if you're trying to use your phone to send to a Bluetooth speaker, you're mildly fucked, because this doesn't accept your phone and then bounce it back out. It would just go directly to the speakers. You can do that with 2 of these, which I actually have 2 of these. I was sent 2 by FIO because I'm using them as a Bluetooth bridge. But you could have 2 of these in use. One that your phone connects to, and this accepts the Bluetooth signal, and then outputs through the RCAs to your sub. And then it goes and connects via fiber optic to the other one, which connects to your speakers and outputs to those. That, my head is like, I don't know if that would work, but that, in my brain, that makes sense. I think this is someone mentioned this, and the Wales mentioned this as a category, and I'm like, you know what, let me brainstorm that. And you would need very specialized equipment. These are like $100 and something a pop, by the way, and you need 2 of them to do this. So don't hold your breath on adding a sub to a Bluetooth speaker unless your source also had an analog output, but then you'd be working with a delay. Like even then, I'm still worrying about the delay, because you'd be receiving on this, outputting out, and then it would be, unless the other one was also outputting out, you could have 4 subwoofers and no delay between the Bluetooth sending and the actual RCA that's going. Right now, I'm putting that in the category of where's my biggest, whitest marker. Here we go. This is going to be the question mark, the Riddler. That's the Riddler one. Like, buy Minirigs is the only thing I can guarantee to you to make Bluetooth work with a subwoofer, because you can buy the subwoofer. They're very expensive, by the way. They're made in the UK. Some other equipment I brought out. I just wanted to talk about some of this. If you have the IFI Zendac, I've been talking for a while. Oh, we got to talk about the most illegal way to add a sub. We'll get to that. We'll get to the illegal way, because something like this, USB input, you plug it into your computer, you get a variable RCA and balanced output. I didn't bring the wire up here, but you can buy a 4-pin, a 4.4 Pentacon connector for this, and then use it just like any other DAC. Hook that to studio monitors. You can't convert this to RCA, so you'd only be able to use this as studio monitors. and then use this for your sub, and then you'd have the basic setup. So you could, if you have one of these, you could buy studio monitors, and you could do this. Also, if you bought a regular amplifier, let me get this back. I use this as an example, but if you get a power amp that has RCA and XLR, you could also hook the 4.4 up to XLR inputs on a bigger, stronger power amp, and then use the RCAs again for the sub. That little SVS Micro is actually from my office. And in my office, I have a Mo2 M2, which is a microphone preamp, but it has both TRS balanced outputs and RCA outputs that work simultaneously. So the RCAs are on really long cables down to that SVS, and the XLR converters come out of the TRS and they go to these. These are actually out of my office too. My whole office has no speaker set up right now, and it works perfectly. I set this up, I set the volume on the back of these, I set it up, I set the volume on that, and I control with the Mo2. Done. I brought this out because we talked a lot about fiber optic being like a required thing. A lot of DACs will take a USB. If you have a DAC that doesn't take a USB and still want to use it, or if you just prefer not to use USB, which I prefer not to use USB, this is a Duke Audio U2, and it's just a USB connection. So you'd plug this into your laptop, and it gives you fiber optic and coaxial digital. And it gives them to you at the same time, so you wouldn't even need, in fact, here's another option. I talked about the fiber optic splitter. So you could either get a Duke U2, which is USB in and gives you coaxial and fiber optic. So one of these could be used for one DAC, one could be used for the other DAC. Takes the place of a splitter. I also have this converter from 10 DAC, which is a converter, and you give it either a coaxial or a fiber optic, and then it'll give you coaxial and fiber optic split. So you get both of those out. So that's another way you could just like get signal converted to give you multiple outputs. What was I going to talk about now? Oh my God, hold on, I've got to think. So yeah, I think that's it for the explanation of everything. I went over the source gear, I went over the different types of speakers. There are 5 types of speakers. There are 4 lights, but 5 types of speakers. And I just want to quickly run down the subs, literally from the top to the bottom, because when you look at a subwoofer, this can make a huge impact on what your options are. I've just gone over them. So most subs, 90% of them I'd say, have at least 2 RCAs, which means you're pretty much covered for all the options I put forth with that. If you're using passive, I didn't have any here to show an example of, but older self-powered subs have sometimes 8 plugs, which makes life so much fucking easier, because you can literally plug your speaker amplifier into a set, and then you have these speaker wires come out and go to your speakers. That's for passives. Most don't do that anymore, which is why you have to use the thin wire in the back, and you can either split it here at the sub or split it over at the amp. So it's just real annoying that they don't offer that anymore. This would be a perfect example of having just another 4, and it would just loop in and out and then go to the speakers. Doesn't do it. But yeah, so the 3000 micro, basically just RC in, RC out, that's your only options. The Dynamo 400, single pair of RCA ins, no outputs, but you get speaker level inputs. You've got the MRS10, which is specifically studio monitors. You can get adapters to turn these into RCA ins and outs. But again, not the greatest subs in the world. Almost no studio sub is the greatest sub in the world, not for the money. Down to the Airmotive SE12, which has the most options, has a separate LFE input in case you wanted to use this in both the stereo setup and the surround sound. I don't know how that would work. I wouldn't run them at the same time. But you have your inputs, you have your outputs, you have a switchable output, makes this very unique, and it's got the speaker terminals that are full-size binding posts, so you can unscrew them, put bananas or raw wire. This one is like the easiest to integrate, which is why I loved it so much. And then finally, let's get way down on the floor, like sexually, is the big old clip. Which one is this? The SPL 150, which again has the least of all of them. It's just 2 RCAs, and one's labeled R and one labeled L and LFE. So if you have a surround receiver, that would be the only thing you plug into. If you have these triangles, you'd plug into the LFE. The reason it's marked LFE, the same as on this, is it bypasses the low pass filter. if you only have a single one plugged in. Low pass filter tells it how low the subwoofer can, actually no, it tells it how high it can play. So if you turn it all the way up, it can play 120 hertz. If you turn it down, it can play 30. If you plug into the LFE, and only the LFE, it can play 130, and the source has to control the low pass. I feel like that's more something along the lines of why you would in a subwoofer setup video. So yeah, that was my whole day, and hopefully not more than an hour and a half of your time if you decided to watch the entire thing. Hopefully you jumped right specifically to the setup that applies to you, whether you have passive speakers, studio monitors, basic self-powered, advanced self-powered, or Bluetooth, which don't question. We'll take that battery death as a sign to end this video. Thank you for stopping by. I've been Zeospantera. If you like these sorts of videos, tell me on my Patreon or Subscribe Star. For $5 a month, you get to see reviews early, participate in yard sales, and listen to lossless sound demos and get to the old sound demos that YouTube removed. For $10 a month, you get into a private behind-the-scenes Telegram chat where you can message me directly about your setup problems, and I will answer you because you're in a private chat. You also get into a swap meet channel there where you can buy, sell, and trade gear with the other users. It's a lifetime in these swap meets, so even if you stop being a patron of mine, you will still be in that chat. Link to everything I've talked about here, link to some wires, link to the connectors, the adapters. I didn't even talk about this. That doesn't need to be talked about. Did I miss anything? Tell me in the comments. And I hope I've helped you add a sub to whatever setup you're using, or discouraged you because of how fucking possible it is. It is possible. It's always possible. The last case scenario is you buy a MiniDSP and it does all the magical things you've ever wanted to do with a sub. But precursor to that is you buy something with a sub out, like a Lox GA30 or the DA9, or you buy self-powered monitors with a sub out. Makes it real easy. If you buy a surround sound receiver, even if you only use it for 2 speakers, a surround sound receiver will plug a sub directly in one RCA and you're done. Any other questions about that, let me know. And if you'd like to see me do any other videos like this, let me know what the hell you want, because this was, I gotta move everything, it's very big. All right, thank you all. Download your wallpaper. I'll give you some random anime wallpaper in the description. Give me one more. Good, that's a good one, but it probably won't be that one. But I'll link something in the description. If you want all my wallpapers that I've ever used, there's a Resilio hoard that has them all. And I think that's it. Check out Hi-Fi Guides in the Hi-Fi Guide forum. Check out Z merch, and check out whatever. Outer Range is a great show on Amazon. I'm sure that's going to date this video. Maybe it sucks at the end. We good? I'm good. You're good. Thank you, and good night.